The year is 1942. War wages across almost every continent. It is World War II. America was not involved in the war beyond selling arms to the Allies. All that changed on December 7th, 1941, after a surprise Japanese invasion on a naval base in Hawaii known as Pearl Harbor. America had not been expecting the attack, and the attack sent waves of fear across America. Pearl Harbor outraged many people and caused many Americans to question the prospect of a Japanese mainland invasion. They also began to wonder whether or not they had the loyalty of the thousands of Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. In response to the fears, military pressure, and believing in suspected reports of treachery from the Japanese American people, the 32nd President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, made the Executive Order 9066. This order authorized the evacuation of all persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast further inland, with over 127,000 Japanese Americans forcibly relocated to internment camps all over the country. Many lawmakers wondered whether or not this violated the Japanese people's rights, but their worries were muffled by the widespread acceptance of racism and anti-Japanese sentiments towards people of Japanese ancestry. The U.S. government made no effort to utilize diplomatic actions like negotiations, nor were there any attempts to have conversations with groups like the Japanese American Citizen League to try to come to a resolution. Since diplomatic efforts typically are interactions with other sovereign nations, treating one's own citizens as foreigners was uncharted territory, and therefore, diplomatic efforts were non-existent. With a lack thereof, they treated the Japanese American people not as American citizens, but as prisoners of war. The internment camps had been believed to be a non-violent solution to the perceived problem of the Japanese American citizens. The Executive Order 9066, however, stripped Japanese Americans from their civil liberties. Many lost everything: homes, jobs, and were only allowed to pack what they could carry. The Executive Order 9066 also left the country divided and left to grapple with the moral debate. What price are we willing to pay as a country to ensure national security? In a country built on the basis of freedom and civil liberties, what values were we willing to sacrifice? The moral debate was set into motion on whether or not the internment camps violated our unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In 1942, a poll conducted by the American Institute of Public Opinion reported that 93% of Americans supported the internment of Japanese immigrants. The number was significantly less, however, when it came to Japanese American citizens. Only 53% agreed that Japanese American citizens should be interned. Interestingly enough, 2/3 of the men, women, and children of Japanese descent who were given 1 week to report to one of 15 holding centers along the West Coast were in fact American-born citizens. The prisoners were forced to live in ramshackle houses or horse stables, often for months, until they were relocated to any of the 10 camps created in remote areas of America. Life in the camps was challenging. Families were forced to live in barracks with no insulation, furnished only with small cots and coal-burning stoves. They had small amenities like laundry and a bathroom, but on the camp sentry towers, the soldiers were ordered to shoot if anyone tried to leave. They were fed like prisoners in mess halls, had no privacy, lived with curfews, and were assigned jobs that often did not match their skill set. Even though the Japanese people made the best of the situation and tried to live each day to the fullest, they were reminded daily that they were prisoners behind barbed wire and watched by armed guards 24 hours a day. Even in the face of such discrimination, thousands of Japanese Americans volunteered for the war from the internment camps to prove their loyalty. One of the many Japanese regiments was the infamous 44nd Infantry. With over 3,800 soldiers, the 442nd Infantry was composed entirely of Japanese American soldiers. 600 of these soldiers lost their lives. The 442nd Infantry Regiment is one of the most highly decorated combat units in military history, with over 18,000 total awards. The regiment's slogan, "Go for Broke," showed their dedication, unwavering loyalty to America, and their perseverance to fight for their country even when their government imprisoned their family and stripped them of their human rights and dignity. The 442nd and 100th Regiment were later recognized with the Presidential Honor for their loyalty to America. The valor and bravery of the Japanese Americans added to the conflicted feeling that continued to bring about a larger moral debate. 4 major cases kept the struggle of the Japanese Americans in internment camps in the awareness of the public eye during the war. Gordon Hirabashi, Minoru Yasu, Fred Korematsu, and Mitsui Endo. These were landmark cases that challenged the legality of imprisoning people who have committed no crime and based entirely on their race. All of these chipped away at the government's argument and evidence for imprisoning Japanese Americans, and ultimately helped to free the Japanese Americans. While Hirabashi and Yasu's case had a swift decision and resulted in a loss, Korematsu's case was less clear. Although his case ended in failure, it showed the public the flaws of the US government's argument. Mitsui Endo's case truly highlighted the failure of the US government. When it was clear the court would be ruling in favor of Mitsui Endo's case and overturn the legality of the internment camps, President Roosevelt quickly rescinded the order and closed the internment camps. These cases exposed a massive failure in human rights protection. Korematsu's case, later, when appealing the decision, also exposed the false information that Order 906 was based upon. World War II ended in 1945, and after 4 long years, the violence and imprisonment of Japanese Americans finally ended. In 1946, the final internment camp closed its gates. Japanese Americans were left to rebuild their lives from nothing, often returning to bigotry and hate in their communities. Many did not speak of their time in the camps, choosing to move forward and reconstruct their lives and identities. For 42 years, America moved forward with the internment of Japanese Americans and swept it under the rug until 1988, when Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act. The Civil Liberties Act stated that a grave injustice had been done to the Japanese people.
My fellow Americans, we gather here today to right a grave wrong. More than 40 years ago, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry living in the United States were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in makeshift internment camps. This action was taken without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race, for these 120,000 were Americans of Japanese descent. Yes, the nation was then at war, struggling for its survival, and it's not for us today to pass judgment upon those who may have made mistakes while engaged in that great struggle. Yet we must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake.
The Civil Liberties Act entitled 82,219 surviving Japanese Americans reparations in the amount of $20,000 and a formal apology from the U.S. government. Many families rejected the money or simply gave it away. Since the internment of Japanese Americans, there have been many threats to the safety of America, but none have set a precedent like that of the internment camps. After the September 11th attacks on American soil, though public sentiment may have felt eerily similar, the United States did not imprison citizens or immigrants from Muslim or Arab descent. Though the debate continues on the subject of national security, human and civil rights have prevailed in the moral debate over the internment of Japanese Americans. America and its people have agreed that the internment of Japanese Americans is a dark chapter in its history and must learn from its mistakes. The balance between national security and the fight for human rights continues in America as we face detainment centers for migrant families, travel bans, and heightened race relations. Based on the beliefs of the founding fathers of our nation, human dignity and human rights cannot be cast away in the name of the nation.